Guten Tag, ich heiße Junaid Islam und mit mir Herr Matthias Gelber und Herr Corey Gray. Wie geht's, Corey? How the hell are you? And what have you been up to?
Geht's gut, danke. Und Ihnen? Ich bin hier im Haus in Australien.
Sehr gut.
Sehr gut, unglaublich. Und wir sind zusammen mit der graue Mensch, Matthias Gelber.
You have a nice
Geht's gut
French
oder
accent,
was,
Corey.
Matthias?
He's
Yeah,
speaking German with a French accent. Well, we at the
yeah,
Smart
yeah,
City
yeah.
Council are a very international group.
Fun, guys. Yeah, a German with a French accent. Where did you pick that one up, Corey?
Well,
Ich
let's not
weiß
talk
nicht.
about that. She was very beautiful, but
In der Schweiz.
so Corey, I know you've been at a couple of shows, and you've met a lot of people. You know, on our last check-in, you had GITEX and then some other events you want to. But before we talk to Matthias about his expertise, which is carbonization, why don't you share with the global community what happened at GITEX before we get to Barcelona? Because it's such a large show, and it's kind of interesting, but it's also a little scary, the sheer size.
Yeah, well, I think the last time we spoke, I was just about to head on stage with Matthias in Malacca in Malaysia, actually. And since then, I've roped him into discussions like this and various other things. But that event was actually really successful. There are about 500 city and government leads in Malaysia coordinated together, really about policy and tech innovation. The difference of Malacca and GITEX. GITEX is 200,000 people, right? It's hard to get your head around it. It's 3 Super Bowl stadiums of people. It's very tech driven. It's very vendor driven, I would say. The panels I was on had a mixture of vendors and city representatives, but it's just enormous. Malacca was, as I say, interesting because Malaysia is moving ahead, I think, in leaps and bounds. Matthias can speak more to it. He lived there a long time, and still has a good connection and understanding to the industry and governmental position there. But one of the things that we talked about a lot was decarbonization and sort of cutting through some of the rhetoric. There's a lot of vested interest now financially and politically around decarbonization. It's a big play thing for a lot of people. And one of the things that we really connected on was what we would say in Australia is cutting through the bullshit of it. And Matthias is deeply knowledgeable in that area. We hit it off, did what always happens if I meet someone I like. We went out for dinner till 1 o'clock in the morning after the conference, and we really started, digging into the nitty gritty and getting to the bones of it. So I was really keen to get Matthias to join us. He's living in Philippines these days with a very beautiful young family. I've been good enough to see on the call since a few weeks ago. So yeah, decarbonization. There's a million things we could talk about in other episodes coming up, but Matthias has got a really great insight that I wanted to share with everyone.
Matthias, thanks for joining our little Smart Cities Council podcast. As someone who's not an expert in decarbonization, I have to admit I find it so confusing between understanding the carbon market, from understanding whether electric vehicles really reduce carbon or are just shifting it, to the real sources of carbon. And what would you really want people like myself who are non-experts in this area to really focus on? Or maybe there's an insight or something you think is really important that people really need to think about from a policy perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Junaid and Corey, for getting me on here. And obviously, one of the first things that comes to mind, Corey and myself meeting in Malacca, we were flying there. There's a carbon footprint of flying. But flying, all the planes in the world together are only about 2 to 3% of the world's carbon footprint. I mean, we are looking for electrification of everything. And then electrification, if we can deliver the supply of the electricity low carbon, then we are making massive strides forward. That's why electric cars are very useful on the road to overall decarbonization. When we look at planes, I think electric planes, we're still a long way away from it, but sustainable aviation fuel is there. The industry has very comprehensive targets already. For me, it's always been, how can I personally be a healing impact on the planet? I practice since more than 20 years that my life is a carbon sink. So the business that I do, the personal investment, I have 4 hectares of sustainable reforestation forest in Panama. It's biodiverse. It will never be completely cut down. Selective harvesting, it makes money. But actually, it sequesters carbon. Then in 2002, I basically as well planted 600 trees, which is average European your carbon emissions that you have as an average European. I started a tree planting campaign in Malaysia that planted 100,000 trees in a peat swamp forest. So the business that I've done, I co-founded a company in Germany that replaced cement with circular economy waste material from steel making, blast furnace slag. So that has sequestered, hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2 emissions. What is my personal ability to be a healing impact on the planet by being below zero? Or we have different expressions here. I mean, I call it a carbon sink, but some people call it climate positive. You're contributing more positive than negative overall to the climate. I just mentioned planes, but if we look at the construction sector and cities, it's the new buildings that we build, because cement is about 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. Put that into context, all the planes in the world together flying every day, 2 to 3%. So it's more than double. And this is something that I've been highlighting since a long, long time. I remember I was in a UNEP committee in 2006 that was looking at decarbonizing the built environment. And I was basically saying to the committee, hey guys, we don't just need to focus on buildings in operation. That's the operational carbon footprint. In terms of, that is scope 2. Scope 2 is your emissions that come from the electricity that you get from an external supply. Scope 1 is your direct carbon emission. This is the vehicle that you drive when you're burning the fuel or you're consuming the electricity. The electricity would be scope 2 emissions. And scope 3 is everything else that comes from your supply chain, your products in operation. But the carbon emissions that are coming from buildings in operation is significant. But the carbon emissions coming from the building materials that we use, cement and steel, it happens even before we build the building. When we manufacture cement, we're burning limestone, calcium carbonate, CaCO3. You might still remember it from chemistry. And you burn that at 1,500 Celsius, you release all the carbon dioxide that was sequestered by Mother Nature in the limestone. So to cut a long story short, we need to focus holistically on the different components, and construction and buildings is a key part of our total city's carbon footprint, where we can make a gigantic difference if we look at the materials that we use and the operational impact. I mean, passive buildings in Germany, Passivhaus, a building that runs virtually on zero electricity. But the big shift there that's going on at the moment is, can we use bio-based materials? Because if we use bio-based materials, a simple example I have here, this is from Dubai. This is made from the falling branches of the date palm tree. You don't cut a single tree. This is biomass that would otherwise go into landfill sites. Here it's been turned into an MDF board. So the biogenic carbon that sequestered the CO2 through photosynthesis is retained in a durable building material. So instead of having cement or steel, which is a high carbon footprint, this is a carbon sink. So those are the mega trends that we are seeing at the moment. And at COP, there was one discussion hosted by Finland. Can we turn cities into carbon sponges? where the structures that we create, the infrastructure, is not the problem, but the solution, because it is made from material that has stocked carbon in it, decarbonized the built environment, rather than emitted loads of carbon.
So, Matthias, that's really insightful. So, one question I have, I live here in California in Silicon Valley, and as you know, Silicon Valley is the heart of AI. We've got not only NVIDIA here, we've got thousands of startups creating apps. And one of the problems we've already had in California is power, and specifically the state of California has already limited new data centers. The question I have for you is, as we look at all of these smart cities built around the world, we see AI as a critical part of the energy management system, both in smart energy as well as smart transportation. So a lot of the new AI chips alone are using 1,300 watts per chip. So do you have any perspective on the potential downside from energy utilization with the use of AI, which I have to say is actually almost universal in all smart cities around the world for energy and transportation management?
Yeah. I personally believe that the positive impact of AI will be bigger than the negative power consumption, and that the technology advancements that we will see, both in terms of cooling of data centers. One of the big aspects of data center power consumption is the cooling. There are technologies of liquid cooling now, which is super efficient compared to cooling the air. If you have a power cut, when you have liquid cooling systems, you have 8 hours until your servers overheat, versus air cooling, where you have 8 minutes by the time which you need to switch on your diesel gensets. Otherwise, you basically have your equipment breaking down. And you look at the big boys in Silicon Valley. You look at Microsoft. You look at Google. I mean, I know it with Microsoft because they were the first mover. They have very aggressive net zero by 2030 targets, including their supply chain. That's why they're aggressively investing in carbon removal now. And this is coming back to the discussion that we had earlier on, Junaid. The past trend was carbon credits. But with carbon credits, like my trees in Panama, what's going to happen with those trees in 30 years? Are they going to turn into building material? Are they still going to... The end of life is not so clear. But carbon removal, especially biochar, for the next 1,000 years, that biogenic carbon, you have turned it into biochar. It will not be converted to CO2 or methane, because the form it is in, it's considered long-term removal. That's what you see with Microsoft. They've invested in biochar projects as carbon removal, and they are investing in alternative low-carbon electricity. Okay, myself as a German, I was a teenager when Chernobyl blew up on us. I'm not a friend of nuclear power, end of life, and all sorts of other things, but it's a low carbon operational power source. This is one of the trends that we see. Microsoft has very aggressive targets of net zero, including their supply chain by 2030. I think they're going to stick to it. That's why they're aggressively moving. And that is part of their footprint. Google as well, and the other players. I'm less worried about the AI growth because the companies behind it have aggressive net zero targets. I'm worried about other sectors that are moving extremely slow, that are considered the difficult to decarbonize industry, and that are setting net zero targets by 2050. That is too slow. That's where we need to accelerate. So my take on AI is, yes, we need to be conscious about it. Yes, we need to be careful about it. Yes, we need to decarbonize as much as possible in the planning, design, and construction stage of those new data centers and those chips. But I am not as worried about that as other sectors that are moving far too slow.
So,
Junaid, just on that point, something that I think is also really important. Matthias talks about the operational footprint of a building. But let's remember there's lots of parts of the world where we spend enormous amounts of money to generate heat for people. So if you step back then and start to look at more intelligent urban design, planning and architecture, these big consumers of energy that are producing a lot of heat that's being dissipated that heat could be used. You know, we're already seeing urban design strategies in very northern parts of, well, Scandinavia in particular, where you'll put a data center next to office and apartment buildings and use that heat as the heat source for that building instead of having a separate heat generator. So thinking about AI, not just in performance optimization of systems again, but design optimization of cities and urban places is incredibly important. And that's the first bit. We've got to get our minds out of just the operational. We've stepped back one step and said, what about the embedded energy or the within a building in concrete and steel and glass, which we didn't mention. That's a very energy consuming manufacturing process. But if we can design cities better where people don't need a car, like in America, it's inconceivable not to have a car, right? You have to get from A to B. Everything's far apart. Your work's far away. Your shopping's far away. Your recreating is far away, and you live in housing estates. In Europe, I have friends my age and older who have never owned a car and never need to own a car because they can walk to wherever they need to get. There's a very efficient public transport system that can get you anywhere into Europe and the world. So urban design and applications of intelligent urban design, intelligent architecture, and planning regulations is something that also can have a huge benefit even before we start building and putting energy into concrete and steel. We can make more, you know, the edge building in Amsterdam, Deloitte worked out after a lot of analysis, they had twice as much footprint as they needed, right? Just by knowing how people move and use the building. Maybe we don't need all of these great big buildings with all of these huge amounts of concrete and glass and steel. So there's even one step further back, just reimagining the urban design and the urban landscape. As we go to more eVTOL and air travel, we should be able to reclaim a lot of roads that have concrete and asphalt and all of these things for urban forestation. There's a whole line of thinking just around the design before we even procure those high carbon materials that I think we should have on the table as well.
Yeah, less is always more, and it's as well a question of consumer demand. I mean, when I moved to Malaysia in 2004, I basically got myself a unit on top of a shopping mall to have all the infrastructure, you know, the cafe place, the remote working area, and next to a monorail. So I just had to step out and step into the public transport. Those 12 years in Malaysia, I never had a car or needed a car. Okay, as a family man in rural Philippines, you gotta have a car, otherwise you have a problem. But it's as well our customer choice. Maybe with COVID, people moving back into rural areas, the demand for car and mobility has increased again. So if we can have both together, the kind of nature, the livable environment, the biodiversity in big cities with all the infrastructure to give us both this nice, I mean, maybe we call it even the forest bathing concept that people have come up with to give us, you know, psychological, mental health support. Maybe we can even have that in an inner city environment. Maybe we can even have that in a building. I mean, I remember the story of a very enlightened real estate owner from the Philippines, a lady. They were in an office in Makati. They had a nurse. The nurse every day had about between 5 to 10 people that were coming in with headaches, respiratory diseases. Half of them had to be sent home. They moved to a Zen building designed to be ecologically optimized from indoor air quality, trees, nature in the building. She told me after they moved to the new building, the nurse was virtually without any work to do because they didn't have the case like before in the other building where people were getting sick during working hours in frequent numbers. So this has an impact on us humans. And if we bring these things together, as Corey said, in a holistic way, then we can get a lot of optimization that will help us to decarbonize and get rid of a lot of the things that we currently use that consume a lot of, or that carbonize, the opposite of decarbonize.
So
Sorry, I was going to say, you used the word optimization, Matthias, which is really important to me. Too many people who run organizations with the mindset of economics and accounting want to maximize or minimize, but there's a point where we've got multiple contributing factors, and we need to, at the risk of going back to school for the second time today, this time into calculus class, we need to optimize when we're integrating that curve, right? Where we want to create a curve that's representative of well-being at the end of the day, you know, resilient and sustainable well-being for people. And there's all of these things compete, and we need to find the level for each of them that gives us the best overall outcome, not just minimize everything or maximize.
Questions I have for both of you, Corey and Matthias, is small nuclear. Here in the United States, really, there's been a huge renewed interest in small nuclear, driven by two things. You know, one is decarbonization, and the second is national security. So the United States is not reliant on Middle East oil. And, you know, we are already seeing the larger cloud providers like Google and Microsoft actually looking at investing in their own small nuclear power plants for their own data centers. So this is definitely happening. And as we need energy, so why don't I start with you, Corey? You know, you've traveled the world. You've been in France, which is one of the early adopters of small scale nuclear. And you know, I know other countries like Australia are looking at it. What's your thought? And then Matthias would kind of love your thought.
So it's an interesting discussion. As we know, politically, we live in a world where people's right to an opinion often makes them believe their opinion's right. We're seeing a lot of tribalism in politics about things that I never would have envisaged that science could be removed from. I had an extraordinary discussion in the Middle East the other day with a young Russian lady who told me she didn't believe it was possible to have governments that weren't corrupt. And I asked her about Norway and Finland and Sweden, and she said she hadn't been there, but she didn't believe me. So these are the sort of discussions going on. So why am I talking about that in the context of nuclear? And the reason is because it's incredibly political. People, when they think nuclear, they think Oppenheimer, they think Nagasaki, they think Hiroshima, they think Chernobyl. I'm fortunate enough that I feel like I live in about 8 different countries that I'm at in nearly every month. One's the US. I'm a lot in Poland. We have a lot of work going on in Poland, and they have a very strong micronuclear agenda as a country now. In Australia, the political agenda and the public narrative is, as a country that produces coal and has a lot of liquid natural gas, is to perpetuate the fear of nuclear energy. So here, if somebody seems to be pro-nuclear, it's like saying you're going to use sashimi dolphins to power your car and you're going to eat your own children. It's so politically off palate. It's incredible. In my experience, the reality was a horrible outcome due to incredible mismanagement, and that Fukushima was a very poor design that failed. But if you look again in aggregate at the overall cost to people's lives and quality of lives and the lives lost in coal and the emissions of coal, and you try and bring that total cost of ownership of something like coal as an asset together, nuclear makes a hell of a lot more sense if you aggregate the amount of deaths per joule of energy created over time from each as an energy source. So you got to roll that out as well to things like wind, where once in action, you know, the wind farm makes sense, but people don't talk about all the concrete you need in every single footing of a wind farm, getting to the bottom of the sea to embed a wind turbine off the coast of Copenhagen, all the steel that goes into it, the decommissioning at the end of life. So nuclear, I think it needs to be in a current and objective, apolitical, and goodness knows I even need to say this, but a religious discussion. Somehow religion's got into politics to the extent that it wants to have a voice in science when we were last sitting together.
Yeah, you know, as a German that grew up when Chernobyl blew up, there's obviously always been a reservation towards nuclear. And the German government, when it asked the main players to decommission the existing nuclear power plants, but we're talking here about something different than the small new reactors that people are looking at. The German government gave each one of the companies average decommissioning cost that they had to put aside as a budget of 5 billion euro. So, but these are big power plants with a lot of nuclear waste and, radioactive concrete and you name it. So there's a gigantic cost of getting rid of it. And if you add that to the cost of operation and to the carbon footprint of operation, then maybe it's not as good anymore as it was. But these new reactors, I'm not an expert on that. I mean, I was surprised at COP in Dubai. The nuclear power sector was the most well funded in terms of presence and lobbying. I mean, they had people jumping in animal suits, marketing nuclear power. So there's a lot going on. It's become en vogue again. There's a big financial muscle behind it. So if these small reactors can be virtually waste free and not have long-term liabilities and can run with a very high degree of safety, I guess then we got to consider it as an option. So let's look at everything holistically. And we come back to your first question, Junaid. When it comes to carbon, we need to do a life cycle perspective, like with the electric car. Okay, we have the battery, we have the construction, we have the operation, and then we have the end of life. I mean, before it was like a linear process: extract, build, use, dump. But now, in terms of circular economy, we want to have a second or a third life. We don't just want to have cradle to grave, we want to have cradle to cradle. So if these small reactors can virtually run, long term without us having to dispose of them in the future, and we have zero or minimum nuclear waste, then I think it's potentially becomes a very attractive value proposition. But I need to look into it deeper because I haven't really done my homework on that subject yet.
Great. Well, thanks for that. So I think one of the things, as we look at to the year 2025 from a smart city perspective, Matthias, we're going to bring you back because
Bring it on.
the topics you're touching about decarbonization and energy and doing a holistic analysis actually cuts through every aspect of smart cities. That we're talking about. How are we going to implement them? How are we going to run them? How are we going to make sure there's long-term viability? How do we make sure the places people live don't have toxic waste? I think your comments about making sure that the buildings themselves were not just energy efficient, but also free of chemicals, and how that really helped people. I think it's really topical. So, with that, Corey, I know you've got some big events planned already on the 2025 calendar. Do you have any thoughts on, what you want to do and certainly, leveraging Matthias in the coming year?
How many ways could I leverage Matthias? I can't quite count, depending what leverage means. We obviously, in 2 weeks, we're in Barcelona at the World Smart Cities Expo. So that's a launching pad for us in a whole lot of different areas. Our North African office, our Zurich office that is open but will be officially opened, our Iberian office with a friend of Matthias and mine, Vitor Pereira, who's, I hope, in bed by now, not out eating snails down at the marina in Lisbon. We've got I had one of the most amazing discussions on Monday with a colleague of ours who's living in Gaza, who was with me in Dubai last week, and Aviel working with us living in Tel Aviv. Now, that was an incredible discussion where right at the beginning, we put politics and religion over here and said, what about the people who live in this amazing part of the world? Isn't enough? I mean, that's a whole other 10 discussions, right? But that was one of the most significant moments I feel like I've ever actually had in my professional life, that hour, just talking with people on the other side of that war together about a collective future. So, but San Francisco, this is core, this discussion, to everything that we're talking about. It's how we contemplate our cities and the places we live. We're thinking about future and greenfield, but there's the whole discussion of brownfield cities. How do you bring new energy systems in? How do you bring new modalities in? Are people going to be landing on the roofs of buildings and not bringing freight and people in the bottom, but on the top? And are cities going to completely change? in a very simple way, you see it in buildings from 150, 200 years ago when you need to put air conditioning, vertical transportation, fire systems. They're not designed for that. It wasn't contemplated. And we don't want to be building things that aren't contemplating that. Can we start to build on a 200-year life cycle and incentivize people that you don't have to crush 4 buildings into landfill in the time that if you could just build one a little bit more efficiently and better, you know? So these discussions will all be front of mind in San Francisco. It was great to meet Matthias because I just heard him talking about all these things that I keep talking about. And the other one we didn't get into far enough was the end of life cost, the disposal cost. You know, on average, there's a nuclear reactor being decommissioned in the UK Midlands that I'm across. They've got to allow 100 years for that site's decommissioning. So the cost is extraordinary. We can't just think about the operational cost of an electric car or a nuclear power plant. What's the embedded cost to create it, the cost to operate it, the cost to manage it, the cost to decommission it? And is that decommissioning able to be part of a circular economy or not? Because then there's a whole 5th element to the discussion around energy. So I'm looking forward as our network builds around the world. I love the fact that I can be in Malacca and it comes back to people, bump into Matthias, have some really good discussions, put some panels together, share some insights with government. We've got the Thai government now, Dr. Non, who is up there. I've got a call with him later today, who runs their whole smart city program for 300 cities there, about what we can, as an organization, bring to the communities there. And so as we build our community, creating value from our values, it's great to have people like yourselves. And every day I'm grateful that this journey, this sounds very sort of Stanford speak, but it isn't, lets me meet people like you and be in the presence of people like yourselves and actually go beyond talking and to action. So next year is going to be, I think, an incredible hockey stick for our organization as we have people on the ground in almost everywhere, and not just authorities and experts, but passionate, talented, intelligent, motivated people doing things. So
Corey and Matthias, thanks for joining our little member update, and we look forward to a lot more follow-up content and analysis in the year 2025. Thanks again for joining the Smart City Council, and join our group on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter. Thank you again. See you soon.
Thanks, Junaid.